The first thing I smelled when I cracked the lock was her perfume and the copper tang of fresh blood. My mother had been dead for 6 days, but as I opened her mahogany box, I realized she'd been busy. Every page of my childhood journals was covered in her handwriting, not memories, but corrections. She had used a red pen to cross out my life and rewrite it. I didn't have time to scream because that's when the attic door splintered open. A man was standing there with a lead pipe, and he wasn't looking for jewelry. He told me I had until sunset before my father erased every trace of what really happened in this house. My own sister is standing behind him, watching me with eyes that say she's already sold me out. In exactly 5 hours, a legal order will declare me insane, and I'll be locked in a ward where no one hears the truth. Let me take you back to the moment I realized my perfect family was a script, and I was the only one who stopped following it. Dust motes danced in the shafts of gray light, piercing the attic vents of the Miller estate. David Miller gripped the edge of the mahogany box, his fingernails digging into the polished grain. The wood resisted, swollen from years of humid Connecticut summers, until the lock gave way, with a sharp, metallic snap. Inside, the scent of cedar and decaying paper billowed upward, thick enough to coat the back of his throat. He lifted a stack of composition books, their spines cracked and bleeding dry glue. These pages held the secret architecture of his youth, the messy scrawl of a boy who believed honesty existed as a currency. David traced the embossed initials on the leather cover, his thumb snagging on a jagged tear near the binding. As he flipped to the first page, his pulse stuttered. The ink was wrong. His childhood entries, once written in fading pencil, were now smothered under a layer of aggressive, vibrant red. Every paragraph had been dissected. In the margins, his mother's elegant, loopy handwriting acted as a surgical scalpel. This did not happen at 4 p.m., David. You were in your room. Grade F for accuracy. He turned the pages faster, the paper hissing against his skin. Eleanor Miller had not just kept his journals. She had audited them. She had treated his private memories like a graded project, marking his emotions as inefficient and his recollections as faulty. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus, leaving him gasping in the stagnant attic air. She had reached back through time to rewrite the very foundation of who he was. The rhythmic creak of floorboards cut through his shock. It wasn't the light step of his sister Sarah, who was downstairs bickering with the estate appraisers. These were heavy, deliberate thuds. 42, 43, 44. The counting stopped just outside the attic door. A man burst into the cramped space, smelling of stale tobacco and industrial grease. James Taylor stood nearly 6 feet tall, his burly frame casting a shadow that swallowed David whole. His cuticles were stained black, and his eyes were bloodshot with a 20-year-old rage. He didn't see a grieving son. He saw a suit, a representative of the family that had once crushed his spirit. "I know who you are," James spat, his voice a gravelly rasp. He gripped a heavy length of galvanized pipe, the cold metal reflecting the dull gray light. "You're the one handling her mess. Eleanor owed me $15,000 for the quiet work I did in these walls. She died without signing the check, and I'm not letting another Miller walk away while I'm shorted." David backed away, his heels catching on a stack of old National Geographics. "I don't know who you are. I'm just her son." "You're the heir to a thief." James lunged, the pipe whistling through the air. It smashed into a wooden vanity, sending a spray of splintered oak and shattered glass across the floor. The sound was deafening in the small space, a violent intrusion into the sanctuary of the dead. David's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't have a weapon, but his eyes, trained for architectural precision, immediately scanned the room for leverage. He saw the heavy, steel-legged drafting stool near the window. As James wound up for a second swing, David lunged forward, grabbing the stool by its seat. He thrust it outward like a shield, the metal legs clanging against the pipe with a bone-jarring vibration that traveled up his arms. The impact numbed David's elbows, but he didn't stop. He used the momentum to shove the stool into James's chest, pinning the larger man against the rough-hewn attic wall. Crates of old holiday decorations tumbled around them, tinsel and plastic ornaments crunching underfoot like breaking bones. "Get out!" David screamed, his voice cracking. He leaned his entire weight into the stool, the cold steel biting into James's collarbone. For a second, the two men were locked in a desperate, panting stalemate. David could smell the sour heat radiating off the contractor, a volatile mix of desperation and hate. James let out a guttural curse, his boots skidding on the dusty floorboards. He realized he had underestimated the skinny auditor. With a final, violent heave, James shoved the stool back, scrambled to his feet, and bolted for the stairs. His heavy footsteps retreated down the hallway, fading into the distance until only the frantic thumping of a moth against the window pane remained. David collapsed onto a trunk, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them under his armpits. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the weight of the secrets he was unearthing. He looked down at the mahogany box. In the scuffle, a false bottom had shifted, revealing a small, velvet-lined compartment. Resting there was a single, tarnished brass key with a tag that read, Bank of Connecticut, Box 402. David? He jumped, nearly knocking the box over. Sarah stood in the doorway, her sharp features tight with anxiety. She was smoothing her silk skirt over her knees, a nervous tic she'd had since they were children. She looked at the wreckage of the attic, the shattered vanity, the overturned stool, and didn't even flinch. "I heard the shouting," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't ask if he was okay. She walked over and looked at the red-inked journals clutched in his lap. "She changed everything, Sarah," David said, his voice trembling. "She graded my life. Why would she do this?" Sarah didn't look at him. She stared at a cobweb in the corner of the rafters. Mom liked things to be symmetrical. She said the truth was often too messy for the family brand. I helped her, David, a few weeks ago before the end. We went through the boxes together. We curated the past so it wouldn't hurt so much. The betrayal felt like a cold blade sliding between his ribs. Curated? You mean lied. You helped her delete the parts of me that didn't fit. Sarah finally looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She reached out and pressed the brass key into his palm, her hand ice cold. Father is already moving, David. He's closing the accounts. If you want to know why she was so afraid, you need to go to that bank before the sun sets. But don't expect the truth to set you free. In this family, the truth is just another way to get hurt. David didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed the journals and the key, sprinting down the stairs and out into the oppressive gray of the Connecticut afternoon. He reached his Volvo in the driveway, fumbling with his keys. But as he approached the driver's side, he stopped dead. The car sat low on its rims, the rubber of all four tires shredded into jagged ribbons. The cuts were clean, deliberate, the work of a sharp knife and a steady hand. A note was tucked under the windshield wiper, the paper damp from the humid air. Some accounts are better left closed. Panic, sharp and metallic, rose in his throat. He looked back at the house, the white pillars of the estate looking like the bars of a cage. He couldn't wait for a tow. He couldn't wait for anything. He saw Sarah's silver Lexus parked near the garage, the keys likely still in her purse in the foyer. He ran back inside, snatched the keys from the marble table without a word to the appraisers, and roared out of the driveway. As he hit the winding mountain roads that led toward the city, David tried to steady his breathing. He checked his watch. 3:45 p.m. The bank closed at 5 p.m. He had time, but as the road began to steepen, he pressed the brake pedal to navigate a sharp curve. The pedal went soft. It sank all the way to the floorboard with a sickening, hollow thud. "No," he whispered, pumping the brakes frantically. Nothing. The car continued to gain speed, the engine whining as it shifted gears. The trees on either side of the road became a blurred wall of skeletal gray. He was a passenger in a 2-ton bullet. Ahead, the road hairpinned over a sheer drop-off. David's mind raced through architectural diagrams, calculating angles and friction. He couldn't jump. He couldn't steer into the trees at 60 miles per hour. He grabbed the emergency brake handle, his knuckles white. He didn't pull it all the way. He feathered it, feeling the rear tires scream and smell of burning rubber fill the cabin. The car fishtailed, the back end swinging wildly toward the guardrail. With a roar of gravel and a bone-shaking jolt, he steered the Lexus into a runaway truck ramp, a long strip of deep, loose stones designed to swallow momentum. The car plowed into the gravel, the force throwing David against his seatbelt until his chest bruised. The Lexus came to a grinding halt, buried up to its axles in stone. David sat in the sudden, ringing silence, the smell of hot brakes and ozone thick in the air. He was alive. He climbed out of the car, his legs feeling like water. He needed to think. He needed to see what else they had hidden. He opened the glove box of Sarah's car, looking for a registration or a map. Instead, he found a thick manila envelope. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them. They weren't family photos. They were shots of him, David, taken from a distance. David at the grocery store. David entering his apartment in the city. David at a cafe. The timestamps on the bottom of the prints began 3 weeks before his mother died. He wasn't just being audited in the past, he was being hunted in the present. The sound of a heavy engine idling drew his attention back to the road. A black sedan had pulled onto the shoulder of the gravel pit. The windows were tinted, reflecting the dismal sky like 2 obsidian eyes. The door opened, and a figure stepped out, face obscured by a dark hood. David didn't wait. He lunged back into the Lexus, grabbing the mahogany box from the passenger seat. The masked figure was fast, sprinting across the loose gravel with a heavy, rhythmic gait. David met him halfway, swinging the heavy box like a club. The wood connected with the attacker's shoulder, but the man didn't go down. He grabbed David's coat, his fingers like iron talons, and shoved him against the side of the car. "Give it to me," the man hissed. David felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. This was his life. These were his memories. He reached down, his fingers brushing against a heavy tire iron that had rolled out from under the seat during the crash. He gripped the cold, hexagonal steel and swung upward with everything he had. He felt the iron connect with the man's ribs. A sickening, dull crack that vibrated through the tool and into David's palm. The attacker let out a choked scream and doubled over, clutching his side. He retreated, stumbling back toward the black sedan. The engine roared, tires spitting gravel as the car sped away, leaving David alone in the dust. He didn't have time to bleed. He didn't have time to be afraid. He hiked the remaining mile to a roadside gas station, his chest aching with every breath. He called a cab, his voice flat and robotic. By the time he reached the Bank of Connecticut, the sun was a bruised purple smudge on the horizon. Jennifer Lewis, the teller, looked at him with tired eyes behind thick glasses. "We're just about to close, sir." "I have a key," David said, his voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. "Box 402. My name is David Miller." Jennifer's expression shifted, not to helpfulness, but to a practiced corporate mask. "Ah, yes. Mr. Miller, we've been instructed by your father, Robert, to clear the contents of that box. He signed a clerical request this morning. We are just finishing the paperwork. I'm the executor," David snapped, leaning over the marble counter. "That box is part of the estate. You open it now, or I call the police." Jennifer flinched. We don't want any trouble. Please, follow me." The vault was a tomb of brushed steel and flickering fluorescent lights. The air was chilled, smelling of ozone and old pennies. Jennifer slid the long, slender box onto a viewing table and stepped back. David's hands shook as he turned the key. He expected gold. He expected stocks. He expected the stolen money the contractor had screamed about. He opened the lid. Inside were more journals. But these weren't his. The covers were identical to the ones in the attic, but the handwriting inside was smaller, more frantic. Subverted Beat 2.6. David pulled the first book from the box. He expected to find evidence of his mother's coldness, a smoking gun that would justify his resentment toward her. He wanted to find proof that she was the villain of his childhood, the master architect of the lies that had defined him. This was his moment of vindication. He would see her crimes in her own hand. He opened to a page dated June 1994. The ink was green, the color she used for the financial truth. But as he read, the relief he expected was replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "Robert sat at the head of the table tonight." The entry began. "He told me my posture during the charity gala was a C-. He said if I didn't improve the symmetry of my smile, he would have to restructure my access to David. I practiced in the mirror for 3 hours until my face went numb. I have to be better. I have to make sure David is perfect, or Robert will take him away." David felt the room tilt. He turned the pages, his eyes scanning the frantic scrawl. It wasn't just one entry. It was years of it. Eleanor wasn't the auditor. She was the one being audited. Every red mark she had made in David's journals hadn't been an act of cruelty. It had been an act of survival. She was grading him because she was being graded. She was teaching him how to hide, how to be perfect. Because in Robert Miller's house, anything less than perfection was a liability to be deleted. He saw a page where the ink switched to red, the color of her pain. He counts the tiles before he speaks. If I breathe too loud, he starts over. I am becoming a ghost in my own home. I find myself watching David, looking for the flaws Robert will see. I hate myself for it. I am hurting my son to save him from his father. The realization hit David like a physical weight. He hadn't found a monster. He had found a prisoner who had become a guard. His mother's cruelty was a desperate, mangled form of protection. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief for the woman he had spent 20 years hating. She hadn't been rewriting his life because she hated him. She had been doing it because she was terrified of the man who sat at the head of their table. He looked at the soot-stained edges of the ledger. He wasn't just fighting for his own truth anymore. He was carrying his mother's ghost. "Sir?" Jennifer's voice broke through the silence. We really must close. David tucked the journals into his coat. He felt a new kind of resolve, one that didn't just burn. It froze. Yes, he said, his voice cold and precise. We're done here. He walked out of the bank and into the night. The Connecticut Country Club sat on a hill 5 miles away, a glowing white temple of legacy and tradition. The memorial luncheon would be starting. His father would be there, counting the tiles, preparing to give a speech about the honesty and grace of his late wife. David hailed a car. He didn't check the time. He didn't care about the duration of the ride. He only cared about the weight of the books against his chest. The country club was a sea of luxury cars and men in suits that cost more than David's education. The smell of expensive lilies was overwhelming. A floral shroud draped over the entire building. As David entered the foyer, the rhythmic tuck-tuck-tuck of the distant sprinklers on the 18th green echoed through the marble halls, sounding like a countdown. He saw his father standing in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the pillars of the community. Robert Miller looked every bit the grieving widower, his silver hair perfect, his suit sharp enough to cut. He was looking at the ceiling, his eyes tracing the patterns of the plaster, counting. David walked straight toward him, the crowd parting like water. "Father," David said. Robert didn't look down until he hit his number. Then he turned a warm, practiced smile toward his son. "David, you're late, and you look disheveled. We were just telling the Johnsons about your mother's love for order." "I found the journals, Robert," David said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "The real ones. The ones you didn't get to edit." The smile on Robert's face didn't falter, but his eyes turned to chips of ice. He leaned in, his voice a low vibration. "You're having a hard time, son. The grief is making you see things. We've all noticed the instability." He signaled to the back of the room. 2 men in white private medic uniforms stepped forward. They weren't doctors. They had the thick necks and dead eyes of hired muscle. Thomas Harris, the taller one, was tapping his fingers against his thigh in a pattern of 4. "Click, click, click, click. My son is having a breakdown," Robert said to the guests, his voice filled with a hollow, theatrical pity. "He's been hallucinating about ledgers and secrets. It's a tragic side effect of his mother's passing. Thomas, please help him to the car. We have a private facility ready." The guests whispered, their faces filled with a mixture of pity and boredom. To them, David was just a smudge on the Miller family's perfect canvas. Thomas reached for David's arm. David didn't fight. Instead, he lunged for the wall-mounted fire alarm, his hand smashing the glass. He pulled the lever. A deafening mechanical shriek tore through the ballroom. The overhead sprinklers hissed to life, a cold chemical mist raining down on the silk dresses and expensive suits. Panic erupted. The pillars of the community scrambled for the exits, their masks of decorum shattering as they pushed and shoved to escape the water. In the chaos, David slipped through a side door into the administrative wing. He knew the layout of the club. He'd studied the blueprints years ago when his father had invested in the renovation. He ran to the main office, his boots skidding on the polished wood. He didn't have much time. He used a heavy brass paperweight to smash the lock on the filing cabinet marked Miller Estate, Private. Inside, he found what he was looking for. The Blue Truth, a ledger detailing a decade of money laundering. Robert hadn't just been a psychological tyrant. He had been using the estate's charitable foundations as a personal piggy bank, funneling millions through the country club's accounts to hide his tracks. It's always about the numbers, isn't it? David spun around. Robert stood in the doorway, his suit drenched, his silver hair plastered to his forehead. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked like a cornered predator. He held a heavy crystal decanter he'd snatched from the sideboard. "You were always the flaw in the design, David," Robert said, his voice flat. "Your mother was soft. She couldn't delete you properly. I should have handled the grading myself." Robert lunged. He swung the decanter with a speed that belied his age. David dodged, the glass whistling past his ear and smashing into the mahogany desk. Shards of crystal flew like shrapnel. David grabbed a heavy chair, swinging it around to create distance, but Robert was relentless. He tackled David, the two of them crashing into a bookshelf. Heavy, leather-bound volumes rained down on them, the weight of 1,000 dead words adding to the violence. They wrestled on the floor, David's fingers clawing at Robert's throat, while Robert's thumbs dug into the soft tissue of David's eyes. It was a brutal, ugly scramble. The perfect family reduced to animals in the dirt. David felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal rejection of the man who had tried to erase him. He grabbed a heavy metal bookend, the shape of a lion, and slammed it into Robert's shoulder. Robert roared in pain, his grip loosening. David shoved him off and scrambled to his feet. He grabbed the ledger and the journals, backed out of the office, and slammed the heavy oak door. He turned the key in the lock just as Robert's fist pounded against the wood. "You can't hide the truth, Robert," David screamed over the wail of the fire alarm. "Everyone is going to see." He sprinted toward the main entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers through the glass doors. Relief washed over him. He had the evidence. He had the journals. Sarah was standing by the lead cruiser, her face pale in the strobe-like light. Officer Michael Scott stood beside her, his hand resting on his duty belt. "Sarah," David shouted, stumbling toward them. "I have it. The money laundering, the journals, everything. He's in the office." He reached for the door, but Officer Scott stepped in his way, his face a mask of professional indifference. "Mr. Miller," Scott said, "I need you to step away from the building." "You don't understand," David panted, holding up the journals. "My father, he killed her spirit. He stole the money. Look at this." Subverted beat 3.6. David held the ledger out to the officer, his fingers trembling with the weight of his victory. He had done it. He had survived the car crash, the attack at the gas station, and the brawl in the library. He had the physical proof. The law would finally see the man behind the curtain. He looked at Sarah, expecting to see a flicker of pride, a sign that they were finally on the same side. Sarah didn't look proud. She looked at the ground, her hands shaking so hard she had to tuck them into her sleeves. She reached into her purse and handed a folded piece of paper to Officer Scott. "I'm so sorry, David," she whispered, "but you're not well. We can't let you hurt the family anymore." Officer Scott opened the paper. David saw the letterhead, Miller Family Estate, Psychiatric Directive. At the bottom was a signature that made David's stomach turn to lead. Eleanor Miller. "This is a forged psychiatric hold order," Scott said, his voice echoing in the damp night air. "Signed by your mother before she passed. It states that you have a history of violent delusions and that, in the event of her death, you were to be taken into immediate custody for your own safety." "That's a lie," David screamed. "She didn't write that. Robert made her sign it, or he forged it himself." "The signature is notarized, Mr. Miller," Scott said, his voice cold. He stepped forward, the metallic clink of handcuffs sounding like a death knell. "Your sister has confirmed your erratic behavior tonight. The fire alarm, the assault on your father. We're not here to look at ledgers. We're here to process a Section 12. David backed away. looking at the circle of officers closing in. He looked at the country club, where the elite were still huddled under the white pillars, watching him like he was a stray dog being cleared from the street. The legal system wasn't his shield. It was his father's final weapon. The perfect narrative had anticipated his rebellion. The truth didn't matter because the paperwork said he was crazy. "Sarah, please," David begged. She wouldn't look at him. "It's for the best, David. We have to keep the peace." The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. As they pushed him into the back of the cruiser, he saw Robert standing at the library window, his silhouette dark against the glowing interior. Robert raised a glass of amber liquid in a silent toast. The cruiser door slammed shut, sealing David in a tomb of plastic and wire mesh. He watched through the rain-streaked window as Robert walked toward the fireplace in the library, the red-inked journals clutched in his hand. David didn't scream. He didn't pound on the glass. He closed his eyes and mapped the building in his mind. He saw the service tunnels, the narrow, brick-lined passages used by the catering staff. He saw the drainage pipe that led from the kitchen to the parking lot. He saw the structural flaws in the perfect Miller legacy. He felt the drafting compass tucked into his sleeve, the sharp, pointed tool he'd forgotten he was holding. He began to work the lock of the handcuffs, his fingers moving with architectural precision. He wasn't an auditor anymore. He was a demolition crew. The cruiser began to move, but David was already gone. Not from the car, but from the lie. He would find the service entrance. He would find the projector. And he would show them all exactly what color the truth really was. In the end, as the red and green ink flashed across the ballroom screen for all to see, as Sarah finally broke down and told the truth about the medics, and as Robert was led away in the same cold steel David had escaped, the world didn't end. It just became messy. Months later, in a park in Portland, David sat on a bench. The foghorn moaned in the distance, a low, honest sound. He watched a father nearby. The man's child had dropped an ice cream cone and was wailing. The father didn't grade the cry. He didn't count the tiles. He just sat down in the dirt, hugged the boy, and let the moment be exactly what it was: a mess. David opened a fresh notebook. The pages were white, unlined, and beautiful. He picked up a pen. Black ink, simple and permanent. He wrote the first sentence of his life. "My name is David Miller, and I am not perfect.